Good evening, Forest community members, and welcome to our Forest Forecast webinar this evening, the first in our Lent series. As always, we are not expecting any technical difficulties, but please do bear with us if we encounter any problems. If you could be kind enough to please complete our feedback survey so that we are always improving what we do, that would be great. And this will be displayed as a QR code once our speaker has finished this evening at the end of the webinar. Also, please do join us on Monday, the 29th of January for our next webinar focused on vaping and snus. Momentarily, I will be introducing our guest speaker tonight, who will be discussing how to have conversations about pornography with your children. As head of RSHG at Forest, I will be covering where this topic is covered for our pupils in more detail when we host our RSHG Insight webinar regarding strategy and curriculum on the 27th of February. So another date for your diary. However, it is worth noting that our Year 11s have heard from Isla's colleague and her talk entitled Pornography, an Open Conversation last term. If you do have any questions that arise from today's webinar, there is time for these to be answered at the end. So please do put them in the comment section underneath the talk. Or we can filter these through the school, either through the QR code, which will be made available, or email me directly on ela@forest.org.uk. I will happily facilitate this and get back to you in due course. So, without further ado, I would like to give a brief introduction to our speaker this evening. Isla van Tricht is a screenwriter and school speaker specialising in sex education. In the past 8 years, she has spoken in over 100 schools, youth and community groups, to thousands of students, staff and parents on topics including pornography, consent and healthy relationships. She is a trained youth worker and has worked with teenagers in and out of school contexts for over a decade. Welcome, Isla. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to be with you this evening. Let me just get this going like that. So lovely to be with you all this evening. I hope that you can see me and hear me okay and see my PowerPoint all right. Thank you so much for having me this evening to have this conversation with you. So the topic that we'll be looking at today is talking to teens in the digital age with a specific focus on pornography. So thank you, Ms. Arthur, for that introduction. And just to add to that, I've been working with teenagers for about 14 years now in various capacities. When I'm not speaking to and working with teenagers, I'm also a writer. I'm a screenwriter, and I also write for theatre. I recently worked on a project called the Sex Ed Musical, where I created a musical out of interviews with young people ages 14 to 24 about their experiences of sex and relationships. And we toured that around the UK at the end of last year. So I'm very passionate about working with young people. I have a lot of experience, but I am not a parent. So the way that I approach this topic is as giving you a kind of buffet of options to choose from. No one knows your child better than you, and everyone has their own way that they like to parent. So what I'm hoping is that this evening will be very practical for you, that it will give you a range of different options to choose from that you can practically apply. And please do filter everything that I'm talking about this evening through your own sense of how you like to parent, your own ethics, your own values. That's really, really important. So please do feel free to do that. And also the reason that I'm giving this talk, I think it's useful to kind of give a context for it, because I have been delivering student talks longer than I've been doing parent talks, although I have been delivering parent talks for about 5-6 years now. But the reason I started delivering parent talks was because it became very apparent to me that although it was great when I was coming into schools and it was great seeing the kind of sex education that was happening in schools, it was very, very clear that there needed to be a more wraparound approach for sex education to be really, really effective with young people, and that there was also a desire for young people to have conversations about sex and relationships with their parents, particularly when we're talking about younger children, younger teenagers. And so that's when it's most effective. And when we look at nations that have the most effective sex education, places like the Netherlands or Norway, Sweden, these are countries where there's a normalization within the family structure of having these conversations from an early age in an age-appropriate way. So that's broadly about sex and relationships, but including topics like pornography. So the way that this evening is going to go, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. I'm going to start off with a brief outline of the pornography talk that I deliver with the young people. And also I now have two colleagues who help me deliver talks in schools. I have the pornography talk that I deliver and the consent talk, but we'll be focusing on the pornography talk this evening. As Miss Arthur said, I think the year 10s had it from my colleague Zoe, who I trained quite a few weeks ago. And then I'll be going into the detail of how, what, and when it comes to these potentially awkward conversations with your child. So we'll look at it kind of grouped in two main sections. We'll look at how do you talk to your child before they have encountered pornography, and how is that conversation different when you suspect or know that your child has already encountered pornography. And we'll look at very practical things like conversation starters, as well as overall tips in having these conversations, which can be useful to know in broad terms in having any conversations about sex and relationships, but which we're going to be looking at specifically in terms of the conversation around pornography. And then I'll briefly talk about some resources. I'll highlight some resources as we go through the talk, and then I'll focus on some towards the end. There is a resource sheet that will be sent through to you along with this PowerPoint. So don't worry, you can make notes if that helps you, but you do not need to make notes. All the things I reference in terms of websites and resources will come through on the resource sheet to you after this talk. And then, yes, please do, if you have any comments that you would like me to answer live, please do put them in the comment section of this talk, and I'll be able to answer those for the last kind of 10-15 minutes that we're together. And don't feel you have to wait till the end to type in the comment section. You can do that at any time, and I'll take a look at them at the end. So I think a good place for us to sort of start in thinking about having any of these conversations, any of these awkward conversations around sex and relationships, but particularly in terms of pornography, is for us to think about what are our own attitudes and definitions when it comes to relationships. What is our own definition of a healthy relationship? How does talking about sex or pornography or any of these topics around sex and relationships make you feel? Do you feel very confident in some areas? Does it make you feel very anxious? Is it something that's a very emotive or triggering thing for you to think about talking about? And what or who influence your ideas about sex and relationships, and particularly in terms of pornography? What ideas do you have of what is your definition of pornography? Is your idea of pornography something like a Playboy magazine? Is it the sort of idea of going to like the video store and picking out like dirty films? Or are you familiar with the form of pornography that young people are potentially accessing now, which is hardcore mainstream internet pornography? Is that where is your head at in terms of that, and what is your influence? Do you come from a very moral standpoint? Are you very frightened about pornography? I just think it's interesting to consider where you're at as we begin thinking about how we have these conversations. So first, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour through the conversation that I have when I speak to young people. And I tailor this talk, so whether that's me delivering it or one of my colleagues delivering it who I've trained, we tailor the talk to be from either year 9 all the way through to 6th form. And so it's tailored slightly differently, obviously, depending on the different age ranges. You know, it's really important with all of these conversations to tailor it at different ages and stages. But broadly speaking, what I cover is similar, it's just tailored in a different way. So I usually talk about pornography and its impact in kind of 3 main areas. I talk about how it impacts teenagers as individuals, how it impacts their relationships, and I talk a little bit about the wider world, which might include conversations about the ethics of pornography and things like that to consider. And that's often with the older age groups. But I always start off my talks by thinking about what is a definition of pornography. So what are we talking about when we're talking about pornography? And I get the young people to give their ideas of what they think about when they think about porn. Usually they say things like sex on video, films of people having sex, sexually explicit content, videos on the internet of sex, etc., etc. And then I talk about a broad definition of pornography. So pornography being visual or printed material, videos, pictures, magazines that show or describe naked people or sex in an open or direct way in order to cause sexual excitement. And then I narrow it down and say we are talking about internet pornography. We're talking about videos of sexually explicit content that we find online. And primarily what the studies that I share with young people, because the way that I approach this topic is very much science-based. It's peer-reviewed scientific research that I share with young people rather than talking about it from a kind of morality standpoint. And the way that I kind of share that is specifically tailored to looking at mainstream pornography, which is the kind of content that young people are most likely to access. Mainstream pornography is the most popular, most widely accessed form of pornography. And the average age of exposure in the UK to that kind of content is depending on which study you look at, averages out about 13 years old. But the NSPCC shares studies that suggest one in 3 young people in the UK will have been exposed to some type of pornography by the age of 10. So something that's really, really important for us to talk about. So I start with talking about how porn impacts them as individuals. So we look at studies that show how pornography negatively impacts young people's self-esteem and their body image, the unrealistic body and beauty expectations that we see in pornography, unrealistic sex expectations, unrealistic sexual performance expectations. And then we also talk about pornography's negative impact on young people's mental health, on their creativity, their drive, their focus, and how in some cases, and this is particularly true for young people, for people who start consuming pornography at a young age, issues around compulsive porn viewing or porn addiction. And we talk a little bit about that, about the science of porn addiction on the brain. I'll send through some resources about that because it's quite an interesting thing to look at. And then I talk about how pornography impacts their relationships. So we talk about unrealistic expectations. We talk about how studies show that people who consume pornography tend to have less sex, are less satisfied with the sex that they're having. We talk about the harmful ideas that are often put forward in pornography. The idea that kind of oftentimes there's a normalization of violence or degradation without any communication about consent. We don't see a lot of representation of emotion or love or connection, intimacy, and we often see sex portrayed in a very objectifying way, and we kind of talk about how that can affect our views not only of other people in a sexual scenario but broadly in the world, and also how it can affect the way that we look at ourselves and our experiences of sex and relationships as well. And then I sometimes talk about the ethical issues of mainstream pornography, the issues of the porn industry itself, the way that it's linked with sex trafficking, and the ethical issues about how a lot of material is made, and particularly how mainstream porn hub sites and tube sites have all kinds of issues with the sort of content that ends up on there. And we kind of have broader conversations about that. Again, I'm happy to answer questions about any of these things towards the end, but I'm just giving you a very quick whistle-stop tour of a talk that usually takes 45 to 50 minutes. And then I finish off the talk by talking about things that porn doesn't show, because a lot of what I am focusing on, and if I was to say that there's kind of one message that I hope young people take away from this talk and that I emphasize, is the fact that porn sex and real life sex are not the same thing. Porn is a fantasy, it is adult entertainment, it's not a how-to guide, it's not a documentary. And so I draw a lot of, I'm kind of trying to dispel a lot of myths that pornography puts forward for young people and their ideas about sex and relationships. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is, here are these things that pornography shows that we just need to throw in the bin, that we need to acknowledge are not real, are not true. And so I think it's also really important to focus on what are the things that young people do actually need to know for healthy, positive, pleasurable, real life relationships and sex. And so I then talk at the end a little bit about the things that porn doesn't show that they do actually need to know. So talking about communication, how important that is, consent, enthusiastic consent, connection, intimacy, love, etc. So I wanted to just encourage you, in case anyone is feeling daunted by the idea of talking to their teenager about sex, let alone talking to them about pornography, I wanted to share some data with you from a survey that Microsoft did a few years ago called the Power to Decide survey. And they interviewed young people aged 12 to 15 and asked them who it most influenced them in their decision-making about sex. And 52% said parents and only 17% said friends. I thought that was really surprising and really encouraging. And I think it's truer the younger that you talk to teenagers, the easier these conversations are. But the reason I share this is because what I'm hoping to give you is a really practical ways to start these conversations. But I also want to encourage you that these conversations are really worth having, even if they feel uncomfortable or they feel difficult. They're really worth having. Don't abstain from educating your child, because if you abstain from it, someone else will get the information to them. And it's most likely that although there may be great sex education in their school environment, they will also be getting a lot of misinformation from pornography, from social media, and from their peers. And so it's really helpful for them to have someone at home who's a calm and confident helper to them, who's a parent that they can come to, or a caregiver that they can come to and talk to about questions that come up, issues that they have, somewhere they can go to that is more accurate than typing things into Google. So just wanted to encourage you with that bit of information. So a question that I often get asked is, when do we start having these conversations? When do I start talking to my child about sex and relationships, including when should I start talking to my child about porn? So if your child uses a smartphone or other devices, iPad, any of that kind of thing, laptop with internet access without adult supervision, if they attend school or play dates outside of the home, in scenarios where they could be shown something by someone else, they consume mainstream media, if they have older friends, siblings, or relatives, if they are asking questions and they're curious about bodies or sex, then it's time. So essentially, you can see from this list that you could start having these conversations really, really early. And that is something that I would encourage. But I also want to encourage you that it's never too late to start having these conversations. It might make the first few conversations a little bit more difficult if it's not something you've started at a younger age in an age appropriate way. But it's something that's never too late to start having these conversations and to keep them going. So something that is really, really important in terms of the specifically talking about pornography with your young person is, if you have not had any kind of sex ed conversation with your young person, so you've never talked about healthy relationships, you've never talked about sex or safer sex or different sexualities, or you've never talked about those things before, do not have the first conversation that you have with your young person be about pornography. It's so, so important to bring in other conversations around sexual health, sexuality, body awareness, consent, relationships before the porn talk. And this is because so much of my work in schools with young people is about pulling away their association of sex and pornography as the same thing. Sometimes when I ask young people, what is pornography? Who knows what pornography is? Some of them just say sex. They think that porn and sex are the same thing. And the problem is if you have the very first conversation that you have about any of these topics, if that is about pornography rather than other things, it kind of reinforces subconsciously that idea that conversations about sex are conversations about porn and sex are the same thing. It also will make the porn conversation easier, if you have had some of these conversations about other topics that might seem a little bit lighter or a little bit easier than coming straight in with the pornography talk. It means the pornography talk is more likely to go successfully in having that conversation if you've had other conversations and set up that you have this channel of communication where you talk about these topics. It means it's less likely for your child to shut down when you're having these conversations. It's more likely that they're going to be honest with you, that they're going to feel relaxed and able to talk to you about this difficult topic. So have other conversations first, set the ball rolling, create that channel of communication before you have the porn talk. And if you're wondering how to have other conversations around sex and relationships, my top resource that I always recommend to parents is this, and don't worry, I'll talk about this again at the end, but there's a resource sheet coming through with this information on it. There's a website called Outspoken Sex Education, and it's specifically designed for parents. It's a brilliant charitable organization. Full disclosure, I'm on the board, but it's because I think it's such an amazing organization and it's so unique. And they have such a brilliant website. They also have a newsletter that's sent out, I think it's once a month. But on their website, this is a page that I've copied from their website, which talks about basically brushing up information on different topics. So if you're going into having these conversations and you don't feel confident, what do I start talking about? At what age? There's also tips by age bracket that you can look at. I have no idea where to start in talking about body image. You can go on their website and find some information that's digestible for you to be able to start off those other conversations before you have the porn talk. So before you start having these conversations at all, but definitely before the porn talk, check in with your own anxieties, triggers, and ideas about porn. So in having conversations about sex and relationships, and this is something that I have in my own training as a youth worker, with anything to do with sex and relationships, or anything that could be potentially a kind of shame-ridden topic, 50% of it is what you say, but 50% of it is how you say it. So it's so important that you think about what are things that are going to be difficult for you. Do you feel very anxious when you think about talking about pornography? Do you have a very strong moral viewpoint about pornography? Is it something you feel a lot of shame about, or you feel a lot of worry or fear or anger or any of these things? It's so important that you process and think through what are your feelings and ideas and things that might be judgmental or might be shaming your child or young person, because what we're aiming to get out of this is, how does our young person feel at the end of this conversation? And what we don't want them to feel is ashamed, judged, guilty, so that they never come to us and have these conversations with us ever again. So that's the important thing, is think about what you want your young person to take away from the conversation. And it's both information, you want them to be more informed, you want them to be aware of the differences between real life sex and pornography, the potential harmful impacts of pornography, all of these things in terms of information. But you also want them to take away, I can go back to my parent, my caregiver, and I can bring them my problems. This is a safe place for me to go to and be open and feel like I can ask questions of things that I'm not sure about. So I don't have to go to pornography, or I don't have to go to my friends who are giving me terrible information, or I don't have to go to social media or Google, which will give me a load of misinformation. That's one of the major things I would suggest that you want your young person to take away. And that's more of a feeling rather than just the information. So that comes back to the idea, 50% what you say, 50% how you say it. Check in with yourself. Where do you feel confident and where do you feel unsure or avoidant? And then you might use something like the sex ed, the outspoken sex ed website to brush up on things you don't feel confident about. You can also talk things through with other parents and adults to plan how to have these conversations. Maybe you have a friend who's a parent who is an absolute whiz at having sex ed conversations, and you can kind of practice with them. Maybe you have someone else who's really anxious, where you could kind of plan things together so that you both feel more prepared to have these conversations. And it's really useful for you to be familiar with the sex ed curriculum, when and what, in terms of conversations they're having about sexuality, device usage, relationships, sex, pornography in their school environment. So what age are they having it? When are these talks or sessions happening? What specifically are they talking about at different ages and stages? And this is both useful for you to know in terms of what do they already know, what are the conversations that they'll be having amongst their peers, and what are they having in their school environment. But it's also something useful that you can draw on as a conversation starter. I heard you had this talk this week, or that they're talking about these things. What did you learn? What do you know? And that can help you as a jumping off point for any of these conversations, but definitely to do with pornography, understanding what you can build on in what they've already heard in their school environment. So before we get into the specifics of how do you have a conversation, and I'm going to give you specific scripts that you can use as well as conversation starters, but some overall tips that I think are useful, again, specifically for the porn talk, but broadly for all sex ed conversations that you want to have with your child or young person. Remain calm. As I said, what we want our young person or child to take away from this is you're a calm and confident helper to them. You're a safe place that they can go to. You are not going to shame them. You're not going to make them feel judgmental. So this, I think, is really important, particularly if you are wanting to have the porn conversation with your child because you know they are watching porn, or you have caught them watching porn, or you've seen that they've searched it on the phone or whatever. Take time away so that by the time you have the conversation, you are able to be in a calm state, so that you can convey the information in a way that they'll be able to listen to, and also so you can create this channel, you can keep the conversation going rather than them shutting down, not wanting to talk to you, etc. As I said at the beginning, don't abstain from educating your own children. Don't just rely on school. Don't just rely on the internet or any of that kind of other stuff, because whilst I know that Forest's RSC program is really brilliant, it's not enough for it just to come from there. And they're also getting a lot of misinformation from other areas. And that's why this wraparound approach is so effective in countries where they have more holistic sex education. when you have the conversation, ask questions, be curious, gently curious, but not too many. It's not an interrogation. And listen more than you talk. Get an understanding of where they're at. It may be that we'll get into this in more depth in a minute, but it may be that their reaction to pornography is a natural curiosity. They might have been really frightened by something that they've seen, and the only way that you're going to know where they're at and how they're feeling and what they know is by asking gently curious questions and waiting and listening and giving them space to talk. Give them some information, don't overwhelm them with information, and have that information be accurate and non-judgmental rather than moralistic. So avoiding things that are just saying pornography is bad, it's really bad, it's evil, it's whatever, but saying there are loads and loads of studies that show that pornography isn't great for your real life sex and relationships. It's very unrealistic. Porn sex and real life sex are not the same thing. Porn can have a negative impact on your mental health. Porn can be really addictive. And what I want, the reason I'm sharing this with you is because I want you to have positive experiences in the future. And that's why we're talking about it. It's not shaming them for what they've done or their curiosity. And that's part of this idea of being sex positive. So avoiding conversations in terms of sex education in general that are all don'ts. So avoiding things like don't get pregnant, don't get a disease, don't do this, don't do that, whatever. And trying to also give them ways that they can do things positively. So for example, in a sex ed conversation, that might look like, or sexual health, conversation, that might look like, here are ways that you can keep yourself safe. Here are ways that you can advocate for yourself. Here are ways that you can say if you're uncomfortable, etc., etc. So giving them things that they can do and being positive about sex, setting positive expectations for their sexual encounters. And this is always how I frame the porn conversation as well. I come into these conversations with young people and I say, I'm not going to tell you what to do or what not to do. I'm not here to tell you off. I'm not here to make you feel ashamed if you are consuming content or you're not consuming content. That's not my interest. My interest is to empower you with information so that you can make good decisions about sex and relationships, and to kind of context that in the idea of, in 5 years and 10 years, what do you want your relationships to look like? What are your hopes for the near future, but also for a little bit further along when you're an adult, when you're a young adult? What do you want your sex and relationships to look like? And how does pornography factor into that? How can you make good decisions now to have a more positive experience down the line? And the only way that we can set young people up for that is giving them positive expectations of sex and relationships. And it's been shown that in countries where there's where parents and teachers give young people positive expectations of sex and relationships. So they have conversations about pleasure. They talk about sex as a responsibility, so that it's an adult thing. They talk about safer sex. Of course, that's so, so important. The safety side of things is so, so important. But they also talk about it in terms of sex being a joy. And that's how I talk about sex. Sex is a joy and a responsibility. But if we don't focus on the joy, we don't explain to young people why sex is worth waiting for, why pornography is worth being avoided in order to have this positive, joyful part of your life, as well as the responsibility side. And continue the conversation. So it's a very kind of, I guess, traditional idea of like the sex ed talk or the birds and the bees talk. And actually that's really, really not helpful. The idea that is most effective and that I would hope that you would follow is more of a kind of breadcrumb approach. So it's kind of little and often. And again, shortly, I'm going to give you really practical ways to continue the conversation. But essentially, you can't sit a young person down and give them a whole conversation and that be the only conversation you ever have about pornography, let alone about everything to do with sex and relationships. It should be something that you have little and often, and that becomes a kind of natural part of the way that you communicate. And again, I'll give you really, really natural and organic ways that you can bring it up in a regular way and in a breadcrumb small conversation way, which again encourages this open channel of communication for them to come back to you when they have problems or questions, which is in my mind, the ideal outcome of these conversations. So scenario one, so this is a scenario before your child has been exposed to pornography or before you think they have. So asking them in a conversation, do they know what pornography is? And talking about it in a kind of abstract way, so keeping things generic. Do they understand what it is? Have they heard about it in school? Again, this is where it's useful to know, have they had a talk about it in school? Is it something they could draw on? Oh, I understand that you had a visiting speaker this week to talk about pornography, or I understand in PSHE this time you're looking at pornography. Do you know what pornography is? Have your friends talked about it? That, again, can be a really easy way, particularly if you have a shy child, rather than interrogating them about their opinion, putting it in the generic and saying, well, what do your friends think about it? Have your friends talked about it? Have your friends ever shown you anything? Keeping it kind of the intensity of the spotlight off them and avoiding interrogation. Then explain the problems with porn. So some of the things that I've talked about, again, you can use my PowerPoint as reference, or you can use the resources that I'll send through as reference to give you just 3 or 4 quick things that you can explain to kind of be like, the reason I'm having this conversation with you is because I want you to have really positive future relationships and sexual experiences. I think that should be a joyful part of your life. But the problem with pornography is that studies show that that isn't the case, and that's why we're having that conversation. And then problem solve with them. Ask them how they could try to avoid it. So again, avoiding just saying, don't watch it, don't do this, don't do that, but saying, how do you think you could avoid it? Given that it's better for you, it's better for your relationships, and it's quite negative for you if you do watch it, how could you try and avoid it? Because what you're trying to do is build resilience with your young person. So as they, obviously, you probably are already very much aware of this, but they are existing in a world, particularly given the prevalence of phones and social media. It's the Wild West out there, and we need to pre-arm and empower young people to be able to navigate this landscape on their own and to be able to make those decisions on their own, because we can't control their behavior. So in working with them and problem solving with them, you're empowering them with that resilience of how they can take responsibility in this, how they can try and avoid it, and obviously coming alongside them and helping them in whatever way you can, but acknowledging that this is a journey and decision making that they're going to have to do on their own. Be sex positive, as I said, couching all of it, and it's normal to be curious about this kind of thing. But why I'm having this conversation is I want you to have good relationships, and pornography doesn't lead to that positive outcome that I want for your life. And as I said, continue the conversation. So this is something that you could say to your young person. This is a script, and this is suitable for ages 4 to 10. It's normal to be curious about bodies. If you come across pictures or videos of people naked or touching each other's private parts, this is called pornography or porn. This is for adults, not kids. If you see things like this, or if someone else shows them to you, you are not in trouble, but I'd like you to turn off the device or step away from it and come and speak to me or a trusted adult so that we can help explain what you've seen. So just breaking this down a little bit, what we're doing at the beginning is normalizing curiosity. So again, if you don't use this exact script, these are just useful things that you can use. And it says ages 4 to 10 here because this specific script is kind of a younger skewing age bracket. But these kind of general ideas that are coming across are useful for all different ages. So normalizing curiosity about sex, this avoids them shutting down. This avoids them feeling ashamed and going silent. So you're not normalizing pornography and saying, porn's fine, it's totally fine. But you're normalizing the way that people around them might be watching it, or if they're curious about it. It's normal to be curious about bodies. It's normal to be curious about sex. You're saying if you see things like this, if you come across this, if someone shows it to you, you're setting it in the future tense. You're not interrogating, and you're allowing for if there is a possibility in the future when this happens that they can come to you. You're saying you're not in trouble. But you're also being really clear about what pornography is. You're explaining it, videos or pictures of naked people touching each other's private parts. This is called porn. It's for adults, it's not for kids. If this happens, come and speak to me. And you're reassuring them that you're a safe place to come to. So for an older age bracket, here's another script that is kind of a starting point that you could use. I want to check in with you about something. If it feels embarrassing at first for us to talk about it, that's normal. It's about porn. It's out there and it's easy to access. So I want to make sure that you have the facts, because it doesn't show sex or relationships in a realistic way. What do you know about porn? So again, you're acknowledging that it's an important conversation, but it might feel awkward for you. If that is something that you know your young person or yourself is going to betray this awkwardness, it's okay to acknowledge that it feels uncomfortable, or it might feel uncomfortable to have this conversation. This is particularly true if it's not a part of your family culture or your dynamic between you and your child, that you don't have these conversations. Again, I would say have another conversation or a few conversations before this. But if you're still early on in that journey of having this open communication about these topics, it's okay to acknowledge it feels uncomfortable, but still to reassert that it's an important conversation and you want to have it anyway. And then you're giving you're saying it's out there and it's easy to access. Again, it's avoiding shame. It's saying, it's something that's easy to stumble upon. It's easy to be curious about. Your friends might be talking about it, but I want to make sure that you have the facts. I want to show, because it doesn't show sex and relationships in a realistic way. And then you're finding out what is their baseline. What do they know about porn? And you are, again, reassuring them that you're a safe place to come to in having this conversation. Just in terms of the calm way that this is being talked about, you're listening to them and going, okay, that's interesting. You know this, your friends have talked about this. Okay. And then continuing to have the conversation with them. So scenario 2, after your child has been exposed to pornography. So either you have discovered that they've seen it, you know that they're watching it, or you strongly suspect that they're watching it. The first thing I would say is don't assume how they have come across it. So pornography is easier to access than it's ever been at any other point in history. It's easier for children under the age of 18 to access it than it's ever been at any other point in history. So it is so easy for them to stumble on it. They could have been searching for something else. They could have been shown by a friend or an older sibling or a friend's older sibling. It's not necessarily the case that your child is actively seeking out or watching pornography. And if they are actively seeking out or watching pornography, they might feel very ashamed of what they're doing. They might be quite frightened by what they're doing. They might be already in a compulsive cycle with what they're viewing. So just being sure that you're not, if your child is consuming pornography, even if it's very shocking and you're very troubled by it, it doesn't mean they are some sort of awful sexual deviant. It is the easiest time ever to stumble upon pornography. And that's why it's so important that we have these conversations, because oftentimes when I talk to young people about pornography, they are concerned about it and they don't know who to talk to about it or how to talk about it. So try and kind of come to them with an openness, asking them what they've seen. Do they have any questions? As I said, they might be very concerned by what they've seen. Ask if they've seen something that upsets them, or if they're confused by anything that they've seen. Do they have any questions about it? Avoid interrogation, too many questions about what they've seen and specifics. They may feel very uncomfortable about talking about that. So just asking them if they've seen things that has worried them or any of that kind of stuff. Normalize where appropriate, by which I mean, as we talked about on the previous slides, it's normal to be curious about bodies. It's normal to be curious about sex. It's so easy to stumble upon pornography or be shown pornography, but pornography itself is not great for you, and here's why. Be open, ask questions, make sure that they're okay. And problem solve together for steps moving forwards. This is giving them information about the potential harmful impacts of pornography, and again, building that resilience. So how could you try to avoid it? I don't want to tell you what to do, but this is not something that's good for your development. This is not something that's good for your future relationships. It's not good for your mental health, for your self-esteem. So how could you try and avoid it, and how can I support you in that? And being really clear about the differences between online porn, real life sex and relationships as part of this conversation. So here are some examples of questions that you can use and ways to start the conversation and also to continue the conversation. So I know that some young people are exposed to porn online from a young age. What do you think about that? Again, an example of keeping things kind of in the generic, just sort of, you could be talking about the news, you could be talking about music, you could be talking about anything, you happen to be talking about porn. And it keeps it in a kind of opinion-based space, which can be really useful, kind of keeping it generic if your young person feels anxious in any way about having this conversation. Have your friends ever talked to you about porn or showed you anything online that worried you or made you feel uncomfortable? So again, it's coming in a really compassionate, empathetic and shame-free way. It's putting the potential blame on their friends, which gives them the kind of get out of jail free card and allows them to talk about stuff they might have seen without worrying about admitting that they have searched it themselves. I went to a talk this week. The year 9s have got a talk coming up. The year 10s have got a talk coming up. You've got a talk coming up. You can use my talk this evening as an excuse. I learned this stuff about pornography. I found it really interesting, really worrying. I didn't know that before. What do you know about this? Is this something that your friends are talking about? Is this something you've talked about in school? What do you think about it? How do you think it affects relationships? Is it something that you want to avoid in your life? How do you think you go about that, etc., etc.? Do you know what porn is? Have you ever seen it? What are your views on it? How do you think it affects you? if they say, yes, I have seen something, asking them, you kind of considerate, calm questions. Did you see anything that scared you? Did you see anything that was confusing to you? Did you see anything that made you feel uncomfortable, etc., etc.? Giving them space to share any concerns that they might have in a shame-free way. By really listening to them, because this is something that comes up a lot, and particularly with young people who are exposed to pornography. I've had parents from schools that I've spoken at come and speak to me and ask advice about a very young child who has been exposed to this content and is really kind of traumatized by it. So just coming in with a real compassion and kindness in trying to open this conversation. So in terms of places and times to have this conversation, there are loads of studies that show that not just teenagers, but all people find it easier to open up and talk more intimately without eye contact. So when you're in a shared private space, but side by side. So for example, car journeys, or when you're doing an activity together, maybe when you're doing household chores side by side, if that's something that you do in your house, you're going on a walk, something where you're in a private scenario with the other person, you're both calm, you're both relaxed, maybe you're not making direct eye contact or sitting opposite each other. It also avoids the sense of it feeling a bit like an interrogation. But car journeys are a really great way, particularly if you, for example, drive your child back and forth to something. So for example, an activity or something like that, and you have a period of time where you're in the car together where, let's face it, they can't escape. You can start trying to have these conversations and make it a kind of regular part. This is what I mean about kind of building it into your life, rather than going, right, we're having the sex ed talk this evening at 7:30 p.m. We're going to sit down. I'm going to sit opposite you. I'm going to have my notes, keeping it something that becomes part of your normal everyday life as a parent and child, or as a caregiver and a child in a family dynamic. But very, very key. Do it when you're calm. Do it somewhere private. Do it when you know you have enough time to have the conversation. And if you start having the conversation and your child shuts down and does not want to have that conversation, it's so important that you respect and basically take a step back and take the gas off, and do not move over into really pushing or interrogating or pressuring the conversation. You can say, hey, I can see that you're really not comfortable having this conversation right now, but it is really, really important that we have this conversation. So I'm gonna let you off the hook right now, but I'm just letting you know that I will revisit this conversation with you at another time. And do it, follow up on it, do have that conversation, and continue that conversation in an ongoing way. And there are many, many ways that you can do this. I've sent you resources that will give you some ideas, but sex and relationships and bodies are portrayed in media all the time. So they're on social media, they're in the music that comes on the radio, they're in adverts that we see around us, they're in the TV shows, and et cetera, et cetera. There's all these ideas about gender roles, sexuality, sex, and there's very much a pornification of culture that has happened as well, in terms of the normalized kind of quite explicit sexual images and language in music and on social media. And so there's all these kind of things around us that we can use as a jumping off point to continue the conversation in small ways. Sex ed topics come up in the news all the time. Something that came up not that long ago was Billie Eilish was talking about her issues with pornography and how she wished she hadn't watched it at a young age. So that's where something like Outspoken is really, really useful, because in their newsletter, they write what things have been coming up in the news. And it's something that you could share an article with your young person. You could share a TED talk with them. You could talk about how you saw this come up on the news, or you're seeing this advert, or you're seeing something that they're looking at on their phone, or you're listening particular lyrics. And again, looking at it with a curiosity rather than a judgment. And this is something, again, the resource for this is on the sheet, but this is from Conscious and Consumers of Media, commonsensemedia.org. And it's the idea of raising children as conscious consumers of media. And part of that is kind of asking these questions calmly and openly to them when consuming TV, film, apps, social media, adverts, music, videos, songs, etc., etc. And it doesn't have to be exactly these questions, but some version of these. It doesn't have to be all of these questions all at once, but here are various examples of what you can use to continue the conversation in a way that is just using the stimulus around you to do that. Who created this? Why did they make it? What's the message, do you think? Who is it for? What details were left out and why? Who was represented and who was left out? How did the content make you feel? Would you recommend this to someone you care about? Why not? And why do you think that? So thinking about not only what their instincts are to it, but where do those ideas come from? Where have they heard that? Where have they seen that? Where have these ideas come from? So all of that are ways that can be really, really useful. So the last thing before we have time for questions, I'm just going to briefly talk through these resources. So if you do have questions and you haven't yet put them in the comment section, please do so, because I'm about to jump back over in a second, have a look at your questions and answer some of them. But I just wanted to highlight some of the resources. Again, these are all on the resource sheet that will come through to you. But the primary one that I referenced and have referenced quite a lot is Outspoken Sex Ed, which is a website. There's also a newsletter that you can sign up for free. And on that website, that's a great place to go for you to, for example, you're now inspired, you want to have these conversations about sex and relationships, but you're like, where do I even start? What are the talking points? What's age appropriate? Looking at tips by age group and tips by topic is a great place to start. They also have short videos that you can watch. They have lots of information to kind of get you up to speed on various things in a kind of bite-sized and helpful way. Lots of encouraging practical tools about how to have these conversations, how to continue to have these conversations, and things that you can share directly with your young person. In terms of things that you can share directly with your child or young person, Fumble and Bish are great resources for that. So Fumble is kind of an online magazine about sex and relationships that's suitable for teenagers age 14 plus. And Bish is also suitable for teenagers age 14 plus. And this could be something that's useful if you have things that you don't want to talk about directly or don't feel comfortable talking about directly, or don't have the expertise or feel able to brush up. You're a parent. You've got enough going on. You're not expected to be also an expert sex educator. So there may be things that you just want to point young people towards. Oh, I looked at this article, I saw this thing, or these websites can be useful. It's worth having a look at them yourself to see if you feel comfortable with your child looking at the content that's on there. But they are both rated as suitable for over 14-year-olds. And then finally, this kind of second middle one is a recommendation to look at TED Talks. There's so many great TED Talks out there that can be a great thing for you to watch with your young person or send to your young person, watch separately, and then have a conversation about. They're great conversation starters. They're great ways to get information about pornography and about all kinds of other topics. This one that is kind of screenshotted here is specifically a very interesting ethical conversation about the impact of pornography and its ethical impact of pornography and its interaction with sex slavery or sex trafficking. And it's about 10 minutes long. Most TED Talks are. And I think they're just really brilliant ways to brush up on information, to have a talking point to start from, to continue the conversation. So I'm just going to stop sharing this and I'm going to jump back over to the main platform and have a look and hopefully answer some of your questions. So do get them in the comment section if you haven't already. Okay, so I'm going to hang around for a minute or two in case any questions come up. Now's your chance if you want to ask them. Also, as Ms. Arthur said at the beginning of the talk, if you want to, there'll be a QR code at the end and you can send your questions through directly to the school if you prefer. I'll just give you one more minute in case anyone wants to ask any questions directly. And as I said, I'll be sending through, you'll be sent through the resource sheet, which has all the information of the different resources that I've listed and some other things on top that I haven't listed as well that can be useful for everything around these topics. And also my PowerPoint will be coming through again, so you can see some of the points that are on there as a refresher. Okay, it looks like there's no questions coming through immediately. So I will just say thank you so much for tuning in this evening. It's great to be part of these brilliant Forest Focus webinars. And I've heard there's some great ones coming up, so be sure to be there. And please, I'm hoping to talk to you again at another time. Please do send your questions through. I think there's going to be a QR code coming up in a second. But thank you so much for being here this evening, and I wish you all a great evening. Take care.